Welcome to 24 Hours of PaaS, Evolution of the Data Platform. We are excited you could join us today for Peter Meyer's session, What's New in SQL Server 2006 Analysis Services. This is 24 Hours of PaaS event consists of 24 consecutive live webcasts delivered by expert speakers from the PaaS community. The sessions will be recorded and posted online after the event. To access any on-demand sessions, please visit 24hoursofpaas.com for all session links. My name is Denis Reznik, and I will moderate this session. I have a few introductory slides before I hand over the reins to Peter. If you require technical assistance, please type your question into the question pane located on the right side of your screen, and someone will assist you. This question pane is also where you may ask any questions through the presentation. Feel free to enter your questions at any time, and once we get to the Q&A portion of the session, I'll read your questions aloud to the speaker. You are able to zoom in on the presentation content by using the zoom button located on the top of the presentation window. Please note that there will be a short evaluation at the end of the session. Your feedback is important for us, so please take a moment to complete it. It will appear in your web browser. I'd like to take a moment to thank our presenting sponsors, Microsoft, Amazon Web Services, Hortonworks, and Redgate. Redgate makes ingeniously simple tools for Microsoft technology professionals working with SQL Server, .NET, Visual Studio, Azure, TFS, trusted by 91% of the Fortune 100. In addition, I'd also like to thank the sponsoring support for this event, Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, SQL Sentry, and SanDisk. The staging of 24 Hours of PaaS would be not possible without their generous support, and they are the reason this event is available free of charge. Make sure you explore everything else PaaS has an offer for data professionals. You can join local user groups around the world, special interested groups, find free online resources through our Learning Center, and read up on the latest community news in the Connection newsletter. And please meet our speaker, Microsoft MVP and BI expert, Peter Myers. Peter has worked with Microsoft database and development products since 1997. Today he specialized in all Microsoft Business Intelligence products and provides mentoring, technical training, and course content, authoring for Microsoft SQL Server and Microsoft Office. Personally, I love Peter's sessions, and I can't wait for the beginning of this one. So let's start. Welcome, Peter.
Well, thank you, Denis, and I'm very honored especially to be speaking on one of my favorite topics with what's new in SQL Server 2016 Analysis Services. I'm also privileged, I believe, to be the #1 out of the 24 hours, so the event has just commenced. There is a lot to talk about in this 60 minutes, so I want to make clear that there are some 49 slides, and I will do them as much justice as I can in this time, and I have lots of demos. So please be aware that you can download this presentation, and it's packed full of what you would need to know is new for 2016, including deprecated and discontinued features, what's involved in the simplistic upgrade process, also a discussion around what features will be available by addition when SQL Server 2016 launches. Let's get into it. So Analysis Services, you're probably already aware, is an online analytical engine, and it hosts data models. So it's there to support delivering a semantic model, providing high performance and consistency with data. And by that, what I mean is that we can connect to a single version of the truth, and therefore we have consistency when it comes to reporting and analytics. Now, since the SQL Server 2012 release, there are in fact two different types of models. Let's briefly review what they are. The tabular model is a fast design with in-memory architecture and is generally easy to get started and simple to work with. The multidimensional is a far more mature technique, and we often refer to these as cubes. We've had them since Analysis Services in the 2000 release. Of course, it matured in the SQL Server 2005 release, and it continues, especially with my customers, to be a first choice when it comes to delivering sophisticated data models. This slide here provides the overview of how it all fits together. I don't intend to dwell on the specifics. Given that this is a what's new topic, I will move forward with what the new features are rather than dwell on what we currently have in the SQL Server 2014 release. Now, the engineering group at Microsoft, when they sat down and planned the feature set for SQL Server 2016, decided on these 4 themes. To use analysis services as a semantic model without storing data, making it easier to create powerful models, improving manageability and security, and some strengthening of the multi-dimensional feature set. We will explore and cover off on all of the new features as assigned to these themes. So, there is such an abundance of new features that it will be easier for me to present them when grouped by mode. So with the 2 modes, tabular, multidimensional, there are some features that are available to both. And then there are specific features that are only for tabular mode and only for multidimensional. I will say upfront, in the SQL Server 2016 release, the majority of new features are for tabular model development. Also, and sadly, is that the analysis services data mining component sees no new features or updates in this release. Let's then take a look at the new features that are shared across both tabular and multidimensional modes. So analysis services management objects have updates, and there are new assemblies that actually break out core versus specific mode implementations. DBCC, so database consistency checking, is now available for analysis services, allowing you to run and check for inconsistencies or integrity issues within the database, much similar to what we can achieve today with the SQL Server database engine. Extended events can now be managed and monitored within Management Studio. And also in Management Studio, it's possible to add computer accounts as database administrators. I will now switch to my first demo, and that is to launch SQL Server Management Studio and connect to the tabular instance I have of SQL Server 2016. And this demo is perhaps the easiest of them all. You'll notice here in Object Explorer that I have a management folder. Within the management folder, I'm able to drill down to extended events, and I'm able to define new sessions. I won't actually create a session at this stage. If I were, I have nothing to audit, that's the problem. But if I were, this is how I would create it. Let's filter down the available events, add in the audit login, and then store those events to a location like a file log. We've now a focus on tabular-only new features. We now need to break down to a subgroup. The tabular mode was first introduced with SQL Server 2012, and we refer to models developed in that mode as 1100 models, and the 1100 relates to the compatibility level of the model. With the SQL Server 2014 release, we then had compatibility 1103, and now in SQL Server 2016 we have a new compatibility level of 1200. What this slide is describing are the new features that are supported in SQL Server 2016 and are available to prior compatibility level models. So the first one on the list is the ability now for parallel processing of multiple table partitions. We see improvements to Dax formula editing, and I have some demonstrations to show the multi-line tabs, comments, also formula fix-up, and the ability to save incomplete measures. There are new behaviors introduced with Dax variables and also a new set of Dax functions, some 59 when I last counted. These will be available regardless of compatibility level that you have. Quick glance at the new functions. I can't list all 59 of them, but we have some new calendar functions, and I will demonstrate these. Mathematical and trigonometry functions, and a host of new statistical functions. And I'll show off the median in just a moment. So, many of the new features that I will talk about and demonstrate tonight are only available for 1200 models. That will require you, if you have existing models developed as either 1100 or 1103, that you will need to upgrade them. So that will become the starting point for my demonstration. What I have here then is a tabular project and a model. This model is based on the AdventureWorks, one of my favorite databases, because it's just simple to work with and demonstrate. Now the first thing I will do is right-click in Solution Explorer and view the code. And the reason that I'm doing this is to point out that we have a compatibility level defined. I could see it a moment ago. You know, I really shouldn't have zoomed that. It was right in my sight. Here it is here. Compatibility 1103. What that tells me is that this model was developed with SQL Server 2014. And note that the structure of the model definition is XML. It is in fact XMLA. The upgrade process then is relatively straightforward. You need to open up the project in SQL Server Data Tools that is delivered for SQL Server 2016. By the way, that is no longer shipped with the SQL Server setup. It's available as a free download. And it will undergo regular updates with new features and fixes. Now, having opened the model, I then select the model in Solution Explorer, and down here I have the property of the compatibility level, which confirms it's the SQL Server 2014. The upgrade is very straightforward. I'm simply going to select that this is now a SQL Server 2016. I'm asked to confirm the upgrade. It is in fact a one-way process, and what it will do is close and then reopen the model designer. The model and the database is now upgraded. When I right-click the model file and now view code, you will see a very different structure defining the model. First, let me point out that the compatibility level is set to 1200, and instead of an XML format, this is now a JSON format describing the complete structure of the model. All right, to allow me to proceed to the other demonstrations, I will open up the model designer and I'll do a complete process. And then switching across to diagram view, let me acquaint you with this very simplistic model design. Having sourced from the AdventureWorks data warehouse, I have the reseller sales. In related tables, I have date with a fiscal hierarchy, I have sales region, and I have product. Let me focus on the product, or excuse me, the reseller sales. And there are a couple of measures defined. I have the average price and I have sales. With the new Dax function for median, I'm going to add in a new measure, which will be the median price. And here we see the new median, and there's also the median X function, and I'll take the median of the unit price. Let me format that as a currency. All right, small but big. This is a new statistical aggregation. I'm then going to analyze this model in Excel. And with a simplistic report, let me bring in the fiscal hierarchy, and let's then analyze sales, average price, and then the new median price. So if you understand your statistics well, you'll appreciate that average is not the best measure when you have outliers that skew results, whereas median is literally telling you where the middle price is when all prices are ranked in an ascending order. Next, to show off the new Dax writing abilities. Up here in the formula bar, let me expand this area, and I'm going to introduce the definition for a new measure, which will be sales year-on-year growth. Now, by pressing the Shift key and then pressing Enter, I have this ability to embed carriage returns and also tabs. What I'll do next is copy in a line of code. And this is in fact a variable declaration. And what it's defining for this calculation is a variable named previous year sales. And we can see here that it's simply computing sales for the date that was 12 months ago. Now with this declaration of a variable, I'll then enter another line, and to demonstrate another new capability is that I can also introduce comments. For convenience, I will paste this in, and you'll see the color coding makes it very clear that I have, with a // introduced a comment. Now, what would happen if I pressed enter? This is actually an incomplete formula because introducing variables requires you to return a formula. And what we see then is that we have an error. Now, the frustration we've had in previous releases is that you had to address the error, and that meant either cancelling the measure or making it correct somehow, even if it wasn't correct for your end purpose. There is now the ability to partially complete a measure. Of course, it will produce an error, as it does in this case, and you will not be able to deploy the project until all measures have complete formulas. So back on track, I'm going to add a final line into my formula, and that is to use the return. And what return is going to do is produce the logic for my calculation. So note how the variable defined previous year sales, and I'm in fact referencing it 3 times in this calculation to produce the year-on-year growth. And this is a great example of the reuse of a variable, which, by the way, isn't really a variable. It stores within its evaluation a result that is then just simply reused in this return statement. I would encourage you to research how that actually works. So I'm going to switch across to Excel. I will refresh, and now I have the year-on-year growth. It might look better if I format that, and because it is in fact a ratio, I'll use the percentage format. And now we can see for fiscal year 2013 or even 2012 the year-on-year growth. Now, another new capability with Dax is the capability to add tables based on Dax. So I'll point out that in this model I have a date table that is in fact sourced from the date dimension table from the AdventureWorks database. Well, I'm going to remove it. Let's remember that it includes a year, a month, and a fiscal hierarchy to navigate from year down to month. A new capability is to add a table based on a Dax formula. We'll point out that that has in fact broken my formula here because this is requiring some time intelligence, and the date table, the marked date table, has been removed. This will be addressed. Several ways to create a calculated table. You can do that from the table menu, New Calculated Table, or the other approach is that you can click down here to add a new calculated table. All right, so my new calculated table. Well, before I actually create this, what I'm going to introduce is a new Dax function named calendar. In fact, it's named calendar, or the implementation will be calendar auto, whereby I can pass in the end month of year, and it's going to produce an automatic date table for me, consisting of a single date column. Now, in fact, when I attempt to do this, I get an error. And the reason for this is that the function is looking for any columns in the model that are of type date, and presently I don't have any. I do have an order date key, but that is a numeric column. So what I'm going to do is refactor the design of this table so it now uses a date rather than a date key. Let me open up table properties. I will deselect the order date key, and then I'll introduce the order date. Conveniently, the AdventureWorks fact table provides both types. So now that there is a true date column, it can evaluate my calendar auto function, and what it produces for me is a single column of type date. And when it scans across the model, it looks at all date columns to discover the minimum and maximum date. And then it will ensure that it produces a full year based on, in this case, recall that I've said that June is the last month of my year. And so therefore we see that the first date, and this is American format, is the 1st of July 2010. That says to me that the minimum date found in the reseller table was somewhere either the 1st of July or anywhere up until the 30th of June 2011. So it's relatively straightforward now, when you have data that supports it, to introduce a date table without requiring one having been materialized. Now, to simulate the date table that I had before, I'm going to extend this with some calculated columns. So let me copy in some snippets that will give me a calculated column to express the fiscal year, a calculated column to express the month, and because this is using English month names, they won't sort by default chronologically. I'll also introduce a month key. This column will be used to sort the values of the month column. And then I would choose to hide this column and also the date column. I will remember to mark this as a date table, and then I'll rename it to become the date table. All right. Now I do get an error. This is a bug, and I would hope that it's fixed by release, so I can simply dismiss this. Note the annotation here that tells me the date table is in fact a formula. When I switch across to the diagram view, here is my date table. It behaves like any other table, so I may drag and drop to produce a relationship across to reseller sales. Let me go and hide this column. Let me produce my fiscal hierarchy. And what I've achieved there with a calculated table is what I had prior loaded from the data warehouse. In fact, if I switch across to the report here, it continues to function. You may have observed that values changed, and that's actually due to the fact that AdventureWorks has some corrupt data. It's actually the fix, or rather the date table has fixed an integrity problem from the sample database. What I love in particular about this is that often I find with my customers is that they're working on sets of data that don't have date tables. All they need to achieve now is a date column, and then they can go ahead and produce with relative ease this type of date table. What I like also is that as time moves forward and we process the reseller sales to include 2017, 2018 data, by dependency the date table will recalculate to provide the new periods of time. So it always will be in sync with the date values within the model. Next, let's take a closer look at the relationships. So what we now see in the new designer is the cardinality. We can see the one side, the many side, but also we get to see the direction of filtering. So we need to stress that the relationships you see here are different to the relationships that you would observe in an entity relationship diagram. In a relational database, the relationships are expressing foreign key constraints. These are integrity constraints ensuring that values in one column can only be used based on the values in a referenced column. Very different in the tabular design. The relationships in fact express how filter context will flow from one table to the other. For example, if we filter by the sales region Australia, the filter context would flow to filter the rows in this table by Australia. And that's precisely what the direction of the arrow is saying. Note that I have a calculation that counts the number of sales regions. When I switch back to Excel, I'm going to introduce that calculation, and then what we will see in the column F is that regardless of time period, it always counts 10. And when I switch back to the diagram and edit the relationship and using the new capability to filter in both directions, let's see what happens. First of all, you see it indicated that this is a bidirectional filter. That means when I filter the reseller sales table, perhaps by the month March 2013, it will then filter the sales regions to show me the regions that had sales associated to them for that time period. Switching back to Excel, when I refresh, we can then see over time how the number of sales regions have increased as the company has expanded its global operations. Now, this ability to define bidirectional relationships helps out in another way. So we need to appreciate that relationships in prior versions have always been one-to-many, flowing filter context from the one side to the many side. Now, in an implementation of a many-to-many relationship, we had problems because the filter context would only flow from one to many, but not from the many to the one side. And the workaround, which was well blogged, was that you had to inject filter context through a custom Dax formula. Well, the great news that with the 1200 compatibility level is that the bidirectional will mean that we no longer need to configure formulas to make a many-to-many relationship work. So let me demonstrate. I'm going to introduce a new set of data from an Excel workbook. I'm going to browse to my demo assets, and what I have in an Excel workbook are the sales managers at the AdventureWorks company. And I'm simply going to introduce a new table, and what's interesting to observe is that managers do not have a one-to-one relationship to a sales region. As we see here for Jay Adams, he's associated with Northeast, but also with Southeast. And yet Southeast also has a manager, Eric, and Sylvester. And Eric is also related to Southwest. And here's a classic many-to-many situation. So let me load this table. 15 rows are loaded into the new table, and then I'm simply going to establish a relationship between the sales regions. Let me hide this one. By default, you will see that it's a single direction. There is a project, or rather a Visual Studio tools options that will allow you to determine the default when you add new relationships. Now, without any further configuration, let me go ahead and clear the pivot table and introduce a new report design which shows me managers and their sales. Now, suspiciously, everybody seems to have sold the same amount, and of course, this is too good to be true. It does suggest that something's not working with our filters. Editing the relationship, switching it across to both tables, and then refreshing the report shows us the results that are in fact correct. Now, I do like to point out that if I were to select this entire range, and Excel down here in the status confirms that the sum of the individual sales manager's sales totals 140 million, and yet the grand total of this report is 80 million. So we need to be very, very careful in the way that we interpret and also share the results when analyzing across a many-to-many relationship. These results are correct, but you want to be sure that people understand why when you've got double, triple counting of managers sharing sales. All right, so the great news there is that no longer do we need to use Dax to have many-to-many relationships work. Next new capability, and this is giving parity to the feature already available in the multidimensional, is the ability to use display folders to group together columns, measures, even KPIs. So let me do a multi-select here of 5 columns on the product table, and then in the property pane we now have a display folder property, and I'm going to assign these columns to the stocking folder. On the reseller sales, I will multi-select both the sales and sales year on year, and then I'll introduce a folder simply known as sales, and my 2 pricing measures, sales / pricing. So you can build up a folder hierarchy or a display folder hierarchy by using the /. Let's see what it looks like. Switching back to Excel, refresh. We now see the reseller sales has a sales folder. There are 2 measures and a subfolder for pricing. Scrolling down to product, I now have a stocking folder to find the 5 columns there. This is exactly the same way that it works in multidimensional. If you use a semicolon delimiter, you can also ensure that your object, be it a measure or a column, appears in multiple folders, but only within the same table. Next new feature while I'm in demo mode. Again, giving parity to the tabular model, to a feature that we've had since 2005 with multidimensional, and that is the ability to define translations. So in Tabular, we can now manage translations, and by demonstration, I will choose the language of French for France, and then I can add that as a translation to the model. And when I select it, I'm going to export a document, and let's give it a good name like Sales Analysis Translation French France, and I'll simply save this to the D drive. Let's take a look at what was just exported. At this JSON document, I'm going to open it up here in Visual Studio and show you that what it defines is the structure of the model in terms of its collection of tables, and for each table its collection of columns. But scrolling down, it reveals that we have a translations collection, and that for each named object you have the ability to define your own translated caption and translated description. I'm not going to sit here now and translate all of these into French. So, like in any good cooking show, I have a pre-built asset for this, and here it is. So, now scrolling down to reveal the translations, we see here that the default language that I developed the model in for English, we had the name style, but here it is in French as model. What do we do with this? Well, what I do like about this design is that you can divide the workload up between the modeler and the translator. And so you can produce these JSON documents, you can send them off, the translator then has the default captions, can translate to the language of choice, and then as the model developer, you'll import the translation file. You have some options here. If there are existing translations, should they be overwritten? If there are invalid objects, perhaps you've since changed the definition of the model and the JSON document isn't fully compatible, you can ignore them. You can write the results to a log file, and you can back up translations before importing, because the overwriting might mean that you don't get back, although I would strongly suggest you're using source control systems. By importing, it is merging the translations into your document. And now the model has a translation to French. Let's take a look at it. Now when I analyze in Excel, the culture can be selected. And here, if I connect using the French culture, we will see in the field list that we have our sales and we have our sales managers. Now, unlike multidimensional, there is not the ability to translate the member names. So in the Dimension Designer for multidimensional, we can choose different attributes that would be used under different translations. So if you want translated members, you will need to introduce those as columns into the base model. All right, so I can now use the points on this slide more as review. We've seen new 1200 model development features, including calculated tables, and I demonstrated the use of the date table. Bidirectional cross filters, so useful in allowing filter propagation in two directions, and extremely useful when you're modeling many-to-many relationships. I've demonstrated also display folders and how they provide a cosmetic categorization of your model objects, and the translations into a preferred language for your users. Now I'm going to come back and show direct query enhancements later when I've got through some other demos, but I include additional detail here for you to follow up on the topic of calculated tables, on the bidirectional cross filters, and now we can talk about direct query. So in the multidimensional world, we have the ability to cache data, that is the MOLAP mode, and we have the real-time data delivered through ROLAP. The equivalents for Tabular have been the Vertipack cache versus the direct query. The enhancements we see with 1200 models is that there are now 3 new data sources. Until now, the only supported data source has been SQL Server. But now there's the Microsoft Analytics Platform System. That's an appliance for massive data workloads for on-premises. There's also the Oracle and Teradata There's also support for MDX queries to be used in direct query mode and improvements and optimizations to the query generation that is then passed down to the source systems. Also, great news is that we can enforce permissions at the model definition. In previous versions, you had to control permissions through the relational engine. In addition, we can define calculated columns, and also, and as I will demonstrate shortly, when developing, you can also cache data in sample partitions to help you while developing your model. Benefits of direct query is that you don't need to cache data, you don't need to process models, and you're guaranteeing that when users query the model, they're getting up-to-date data. All right, so this works very well in partnership with the in-memory technologies available with the SQL Server database engine, for example, is that column store indexes could have optimized, compressed, and placed data into memory, and the analysis services tabular model is simply a semantic layer on top of it. The next topic then, moving on still with 1200 models, but now a look at management features. So we have a new object model, tabular object model with the acronym TOM, and also a new scripting language, TMSL. So a glance here at the tabular object model is that you can now use familiar objects. So the way that it worked in prior versions of the tabular engine is that it coerced its definition into the XMLA. It sort of made it think that it was really a multi-dimensional structure. Now it is using a native tabular object model, the root being the database, next with the model with a collection of tables, and so on. It's very, very intuitive. And this promotes simpler and more readable code, as can be shown here. In this TOM example, I've written a C# method to reprocess a table. And by passing in a connection string and a database name and a table name, it's very self-evident. It almost does not require comments to describe what is taking place inside this method. Moving on to the scripting language, it allows for simplified scripting and development of tabular models. So I demonstrated to you that upon upgrade of my 1103 model, the code view of it then showed me a JSON document. Well, it's not just the model definition, but it's also database commands, including any DDL to create, alter, or delete, and operations like backup, restore are all expressed now through tabular model scripting language, only for 1200 models. What is also good to understand is that when changes are made in the model designer, that this script is very concise and targeted. It can send a targeted alter to change the definition, for example, of the folder name of a measure, and what it will do is only what it needs to do. So what you will discover is that when you're designing your models is that some of the changes you make, because they are instantly reflected in a workspace database, is that this happens much, much more quickly. All right, we can also invoke scripts through PowerShell, and I have some demonstrations on it. So here's some examples of TMSL. Left-hand side, again, it's human readable. It's a refresh command, a full refresh of this database and this table within this database. And the right-hand side expresses a script to back up my database. Let me switch back to the model that I've been demonstrating. I'm going to deploy this to my server, and then I'll close the project. What that now means is that I have a deployed database that is now processed. And when I manage the partitions here in Management Studio, I'm going to rename this partition to reseller sales calendar year 2010. I'm going to apply a where clause. Instead of clicking OK, I'm going to use Management Studio's ability to just script this configuration. And because this is a 1200 model, I'll just cancel the interface. And there is the scripting language required to create or replace this partition. All right, by pressing F5, I will execute the script. I will also create several other partitions. So with relative ease, whether it's you or whether it's some process like integration services in recognition that we've moved forward to a new year, basically with a template and a search and replace, I've just created the 2011 partition. Let me repeat this for calendar year 2012 and 2013 also. Wrong command, F5. Right, now in Object Explorer, when I open up the partitions window, we see evidence of, and even a misspelled partition down here. Let me take this one step further. What if I process, and a full process of all of these partitions? Again, I could script this. And here is the script to refresh with a full process all of these partitions. Let me execute it. Let's take a look then at PowerShell. So what I can do is, let's go ahead and get a command. What are the commandlets available? And what we see is that we have the invoke AS command. All right, rather than type in lots of commands, I'm going to rely on my snippets for this. So I'm going to import the SQL PS module. And then I'm going to go to the root of SQL Server, SQL AS, and then I have an instance called SQL Server 2016 BI Tabular, and then I'll navigate within its databases collection. And I discover that there's just one item in that collection, which is the sales analysis database that I just deployed. How about I process it? So let me invoke process AS database. And I might need to spell that correctly. 2 S's in process. And it says, what is the database name? Sales analysis. I could pass that in through parameters, and let's do a full refresh of that database. All right, there you go. That's the PowerShell and the ability to execute scripts. The topic now is multi-dimensional. So there's just the one slide here, as I said up front, is that most of the new features added in SQL Server 2016 are for tabular, but let's take a look at what new features are available exclusively in multi-dimensional mode. Distinct count rollup optimizations when using DB2 and Oracle data sources, drill through multi-selection support with Excel 2016. So there is a frustration where you have a drill through action and yet you may have a slicer and you might have multiple sales regions selected. You can't drill through. Well, with Excel 2016 and SQL Server 2016, this is now possible. There are also Excel query optimizations. So with Excel pivot tables, they're now optimized when tables and subtotals are turned off. Whether that's what you want or not, what I would suggest is that if you're suffering very poor performance for particular pivot table configurations, with Excel 2016 and SQL Server 2016, you may turn off the subtotals and totals to see whether that's going to improve performance. There's a good possibility that it will. All right, before I get into deprecated features, let's take a look at the direct query. So I'm going to open up the solution that I just deployed, close this model, and let me add in a new project. This project will be an analysis services tabular project, and I'll name this the sales analysis, but DQ for direct query. All right, it wants to know where is my workspace server to host the database. Note the default compatibility is set to 1103. That is in fact a tools options that you can configure, and I would suggest all new projects would be set to 1200. With the creation of the project, I'm going to select the model and switch the direct query mode to on. Well, in fact, before I do, if I were to import data, you're probably already familiar with the wide variety of possible data sources. When you switch the direct query mode to on, you are limited only to those sources that support direct query. So the great news in 2016 is you now have the Analytics Platform System, Oracle, and Teradata. So with a very simplistic design, let me introduce a single fact table from the AdventureWorks data warehouse. And that will be the fact reseller sales. Now, as it's direct query mode, when I click Finish, no rows are transferred. In fact, if I deployed this and we queried the model, it would be a pass-through, and analysis services would construct optimized SQL and pass it down to the database. Let's make this a little more interesting. So, under table partitions, when in direct query mode, it's now possible to create what's called a sample partition. So, this sample partition, I'm going to load a small set of data that's going to help me develop and work with the model. Switching the query to SQL, I'm just going to add a where clause that ensures that this is a small set of data. Now when I do a model process, there is indeed data. In fact, just 352 rows of data for that time period. And this helps me work with the model in a more intuitive way that perhaps you're familiar with when you're working with the caching mode. Now what is new with direct query is that we can add calculated columns. So perhaps I want to know what the profit amount is. This was not possible previously. So not all Dax functions will work here. You need to remember that your calculated columns will be translated to T-SQL in this case, and there are not equivalents for every Dax function. So if you choose a Dax function that isn't supported, you will receive a design time error. Let me rename this to profit amount, and then I will create a measure which will sum the values of that, and that will simply be profit. I'll point out also that model menu roles. This is new also with direct query. You can enforce roles with filtered sets for different audiences connecting to your model. All right, I will deploy or just connect in Excel. And when I connect in Excel, I have the ability to connect either using that sample partition or the full data, which is the direct query mode. Let's have a look at the sample data. So here's my profit, and that is being generated from the cache data in the model. Let's break that down by, I don't know, employee key. Now it's of interest to take a look at the connection properties. So there's a new property that is called the data view. And you can see here by our selection in the dialog window when we were to analyze in Excel that it's been set to sample. But you could connect with either sample or the full view. And when I change this, this is now a direct query hitting SQL Server to retrieve this result. That concludes my series of demonstrations. Let's move on to the topics then of what is being deprecated. Now, deprecated means it still exists in the product, but it is being marked for discontinuation. So if you have these features in your SQL Server solutions today, you may give careful consideration to them and their longevity because they're not promised to be available in future releases. All right, so remote partitions, dimensional write-back, linked dimensions will be disappearing in some time. I don't believe there's a commitment to a release or date, but they are marked for deprecation. What else do we have? Not supported in future releases of SQL Server. No, I'm sorry. The first 4 are not supported in the next major release of SQL Server, and the last 4, at some stage, they will be removed. So your tabular models 1100 and 1103 will no longer be supported at some stage. And to be honest, I cannot think of a compelling reason, if you are in SQL Server 2016, that you would continue to work with 1100 and 1103 compatibility levels. discontinued features, this is different. In SQL Server 2016, these have been removed. There is nothing majorly, well, I can't see anything that's going to be breaking. The non-empty behavior was something that was encouraged in 2005 but discouraged from 2008. The topic of upgrading, well, I think I've demonstrated how relatively straightforward it can be. Upgrading to 2016 analysis services is achieved by both a server instance upgrade and a database upgrade. I mentioned the new DBCC for analysis services, and after upgrading it is strongly recommended that you run it to ensure that there are no consistency or integrity issues. When doing a server instance upgrade, this can be achieved in place or by side-by-side upgrade. You can upgrade a SQL Server 2008 or later instance of analysis services, but note you cannot change the server mode. So 2008 obviously was multi-dimensional. You may upgrade it to a multi-dimensional of SQL Server 2016. Prior analysis services database versions can also be hosted, or they may be upgraded. So this table here specifies what SQL Server 2016 will host: multi-dimensional models 1050 and 1100, or the tabular 1100, 1103, and 1200. If you're upgrading a non-direct query database, you upgrade the SQL Server Data Tools project and then you deploy to the upgraded server. So I demonstrated this early on in this presentation this evening. Do note that direct query databases cannot be upgraded in place. You'll need to run through this set of steps, turn off direct query, update the compatibility level, turn direct query back on, and then deploy to your SQL Server 2016 machine. Tabular databases benefit most from an upgrade in 2016. You can take advantage of all of the great new developer features, the revised direct query, and also the new scripting and object model. All right, quick word on features by addition. So it has been announced that SQL Server 2016 will support analysis services only in Enterprise Standard and a developer. Note that the edition, formerly known as Business Intelligence, is no longer available. What this means is that Tabular is now available in Standard, but you'll find that advanced features like translations, like direct query, are only available in Enterprise Edition. So I strongly encourage you to take a look at the features by edition matrix to understand what you do and what you don't get with the different editions of SQL Server 2016. Here we see it in Tabular. Standard Edition will not give you perspectives, multiple partitions, or direct query. In multi-dimensional, these Standard Edition features or Standard Edition will not support these features. Lastly, opportunities. Upgrade your models to fully benefit from the new feature set in 2016 and exploit the enhanced features and performance of direct query, the ability to connect to 3 different store types, APS, Oracle, and Teradata, the ability to enforce permissions, use DAX or MDX tools against your direct query models. So, in summary, and we're about to lead into question time, this is in fact the 7th release of Analysis Services, and I hope that I've been able to convey the amazing new feature sets delivered. Also inspiring you that the upgrade is a reasonably simple process and that direct query becomes so much more viable of providing that semantic model across your large relational sources without the need to cache or process or maintain another set of data. All right, include numerous resources that back up what I have said in this presentation. I'll remind you that this presentation is available for download, so you can gain easy access to the links. I love this one, so I produced a virtual lab for Microsoft, and I include the link here. It is in fact a comprehensive lab that walks through pretty much what I demonstrated today. So if you'd like a first-hand, no cost or obligation experience, you can use this link to launch a virtual lab and to work through most of the new capabilities delivered with the Tabular Mode. I am at the end of what I need to say, and I will welcome any questions.
Thank you, Peter. Yes, we have several questions. First of them related to the part of your session when you created a calculated table. Is linking by date supposed to be slower than linking by date key?
So, okay, well this is an internals topic. So generally speaking, integer values and exact numerics will compress better and therefore you will get better performance. For a date table, given that we have typically 365 rows in a year. So I'm not too concerned about the date table, but if you have extremely large fact tables that are using the date, then yes, there could be a performance implication for it. But I think, and this is just me guessing, it would probably only show up when you have considerable large volumes of data, if it shows up at all. My answer to this would be trial it and see. If it wasn't optimized, well then I wouldn't be leveraging this new DAX calculated table. I will add one more comment there. Be careful with the calendar functions that if you have, for example, a customer table and they have a date of birth column, it will consider it also. So if you have older customers, you will have a large date table based on the minimum birth date of your customer.
Okay, thank you. Next question. There are several questions related to the same topic. Is JSON replacing XML in multidimensional model?
No, no. So there is no change to the scripting language used for multidimensional. JSON format, the scripting language only applies to Tabular Mode, compatible level 1200.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Will the bidirectional relationships also become available in Power Pivot, Power BI?
Great question. Well, the fact is the bidirectional relationships were first made available through Power BI Desktop. All right, so we had them many, many more months earlier than we saw them arrive in the Tabular Designer. I cannot speak for Power Pivot. I do not know the answer on it, but certainly Power BI Desktop supports bidirectional relationships, exactly as I demonstrated.
Thank you. Next question. Is there many-to-many change available for both tabular and cubes?
So multi-dimensional has no change to the way that it implements a many-to-many relationship. You still have the many-to-many dimension usage type. All right, no change to multi-dimensional. It can continue to implement many-to-many scenarios.
Thank you. Next number of questions. Is row-level security available in analysis services tabular model?
Yes, it is. So row-level security, you have the ability to define model roles, and roles can define DAX expressions to filter rows. So this has been a possibility since the first release in SQL Server 2016, but what is new is in direct query mode. We can now use DAX filters or DAX expressions to filter rows in the direct query mode.
Okay, thanks. Next question. Not many new features for multidimensional models. Are they going to be deprecated eventually?
Well, I can answer that. I covered what's been marked for deprecation and discontinuation, and when I last looked at it, I did not see that the multidimensional mode was listed. Microsoft acknowledged that this is a very powerful platform for building analytic services and that customers have built dependency on it. So I would be extremely surprised, while I'm not speaking on behalf of Microsoft, I would be extremely surprised, as would my customers, that Microsoft would choose to discontinue such a comprehensive and robust platform for building sophisticated models. That is my answer, that is not Microsoft's.
Okay, one more question. Is cell-level security available now in Analysis Services 2016 tabular model?
Cell level?
Cell level.
No. So there is not such a concept within the tabular object model. So the best you can do is the intersection of rows to get to a granularity that you might consider to be a cell. So multiple table filter expressions could limit access at a cell level. So the general answer is that tabular is far more simplistic in its implementation of row-level securities, and it cannot achieve the fine-grained control that you can with MDX and assemblies and custom logic in MDX and multidimensional roles.
Okay, and the last questions. Can tabular model replace OLAP cubes?
In certain situations, yes, they can. And so from my experience, generally when you have simplistic models, and by simplistic I mean sum, min, max count, and you're not looking for native parent-child relationships or very sophisticated hierarchical logic, then yes, there's an overlap. And I would suggest between, I'm not sure, 60 to 80% of models might fit both ways. But the moment that you're looking for very sophisticated financial modeling, for example, with parent-child hierarchies, then Tabular cannot today achieve that. So there's a time and place for both, and there's a good overlap where you could consider both types for your solution.
Thank you. There are a few more questions, but looks like time is over, so we need to finish this session. Thank you, Peter, for presenting. And it's time to switch to the next session, Gentle Introduction to Data Analytics in SQL Server 2016 by Stacia Varga. Thank you, Peter, for doing this session, and thank you all for attending.
Thank you. You're welcome.